Hello everybody, my name is Ray Terrell and this is a demo video. I designed it this way through YouTube mainly for the audio portion. It was the only way I could combine the PowerPoint video with an audio feed using the limited resources that I have. Normally the PowerPoint video would be projected on a wall and I would be in a lecture kind of mode. So please bear that in mind and excuse the technically challenged format that I'm using. Okay, the presentation is called Adolescent Substance Abuse, The Perfect Storm. And I'll begin with a couple of statistics and then a little about my life as an addict. And then we'll proceed through the video. 11 million teenagers sought help for addiction in 2010. And 90% of Americans that suffer from addiction began using drugs before the age of 18, during their teenage years. I am one of those Americans, and I became an addict. My parents divorced when I was 7 years old, and like most kids do when that happens, I figured it was my fault, because it must have been something I did to make them break up. If I were a better kid, they would want to stay together. It had a huge effect on me. I was broken and I didn't know it. I began looking for something to fix me or fix myself and to fill the hole that had been put there. Growing up, I was confused and rebellious. I didn't know who I was or where I was going. I grew up feeling rejection, resentment, pain, and the way I acted out on those feelings was to escape them. And the way I escaped them was to use drugs. I didn't know I was broken, I just knew I had this pain. And when I looked around and I saw my friends looking happy and looking cool, I wanted that too. I wanted to feel the way they looked. So I chose my friends by the way they looked and the way they acted. And I began getting in trouble. By the time I was 12, I'd been arrested twice. And so when my girlfriend asked me, hey Ray, you want to get high? I said, yeah, sure. Let's do it. It was the first thing for me. It was new back then. Everybody was doing it. But I was ripe for something like that. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew that it had to have been good, And I was 14 when I smoked my first joint. And I liked smoking pot because it took me to a place where I didn't have to feel. The fear went away, the confusion went away. I felt part of something bigger. And I thought I was cool. But the truth was I was doing the wrong things in the wrong places with the wrong people. And I was 15 when I took my first pill. And by the time I was in my 20s, I had abused almost every drug on the planet except for one. I had 2 abortions, and I was well on my way to a life of addiction. So, my mom did what any good mother would do. She sent me to Catholic school, and it was the best education I ever had. But it didn't help my drug problem one bit. I just found a better class of guys to get high with. Anyway, I was just getting started. Then I found alcohol. And I remember thinking, where has this been all my life? My choice. Alcohol just, when I took my first drink, I still remember it was a rum and coke. And, it went down and it gave me that warm feeling. And I felt like, again, just like I had before, I belonged. And the fear went away and the brokenness went away. And my drink of choice was a rum and coke. because pirates drank rum. Someone asked me one time, said, "Hey Ray, what's your favorite drink?" I said, "I don't know. The fifth one." The fifth one, I guess, because, that was the one that did it for me. And I drank alcohol almost all my life from that point on. I didn't have to feel. The fear went away. The confusion went away. I felt like I belonged. I actually believed that I needed drugs and alcohol to complement my life. I thought I was different. I thought this was what I had to do to survive. But what I had was I had this God-sized hole in my soul that only God could fill. And for the next 20 years, I battled addiction. And then one night I had lost count. I forgot how many pills I had taken. I forgot how much I had drank. I was with my wife, and my heart stopped beating. And she was in the bedroom, and my wife sleeps like a freight train could go by and it wouldn't wake her up. And but for some reason that night, she woke up. She woke up at just the right time. And she come out and pushed me, and I didn't move. And so she called the paramedics. And my heart stopped beating. I flatlined twice on the way to the hospital. I actually died twice that night. But God said, "No. I have a plan for you. I'm not ready for you yet. I got some things in mind, apparently." And I lived through that. And I remember waking up in the hospital feeling like, oh my God, what did I do? All the regret and all the remorse, and it all came rushing back. And so, addiction is like an elevator that only goes one way, down. And sometimes people do die. The statistics are absolutely staggering. 105,000 Americans die every year from prescription drugs alone. 22,000 from alcohol-related deaths. And of those numbers, about 4,000 of them are teenagers. So there's this distinction that I want to make. And at the heart of this distinction lies the understanding of substance abuse. There is what alcohol and drugs do to you. That would be the physical, mental, short and long-term effects, and I'll go over them. There's what alcohol and drugs do to you. And there is what alcohol and drugs do for you. Your expectations, how they perform within you. What do you expect? What do they do for you? What are your expectations before you pick up that drink, before you pick up that drug? This is key to understanding what substance abuse is about, what alcohol and drugs do to you. And we all know that because we see people get high, we see people get drunk, and sometimes they look like they're in control, and often they don't. But it's what they do for you when you want to consider what substance abuse is about. When I drank, in my mind, I was better at everything. I could run faster. I could climb faster. I was better looking. I could do it all at one time. And that's what I thought in my mind whenever I would drink and do drugs. And I never once imagined a bad ending at the end of a night out. I didn't get up that morning and say, hey, I think I'm going to get drunk and trip over a bench. You know, it was always what I expected was something so much different and better than it turned out to be. You know, when I drank or used, I could go places no man had ever gone before, and I never once had to leave the house. And when I drank and did drugs, I was 10 feet tall and bulletproof. And when I got high, I was Superman. Drinking and doing drugs changes the way you act, the way you see yourself, the way others see you. You know, you may feel like you're having a good time and looking cool, but are you? You know, that's where all the illusion lies. And I never once planned on fighting with my girlfriend at the end of the night, you know? That wasn't part of the plan. And getting arrested was never part of the plan. What matters is how you regard drugs and alcohol. You know, how do you see them? Is alcohol a beverage for special occasions and then only in moderation? Or is it a way to get happy and have fun? You know, are pain pills a medicine to help manage physical pain? Prescribed only by a doctor. Or a way to cope and relieve stress and worry? Is marijuana an illegal drug with proven negative consequences? Or a way to party and smoke up with friends? How do you regard drugs and alcohol? These are the questions you have to ask yourself. Okay, I began by telling you 11 million teenagers sought help for addiction in 2010. That's 11 million teenagers. You know, that's big. That's huge. These statistics, I didn't make them up. This is from CASA and NIDA. These are companies, these are agencies that compile surveys and come up with these stats. And they spend hours and hours of time and studies coming up with this. And I can give you resources on how to get in touch with them if you need it. And 90% of Americans, this is where we started off, 90% of Americans that currently suffer from addiction began using drugs before the age of 18. What does that say? That tells me that when we're teenagers, we're at risk. Well, why is it then? You know, the average age of drinking, does anybody know that? It's 13. The average age that somebody begins to drink is age 13. So this has a message, and it needs to be shouted from the rooftops. 75, now these are CASA. This is CASA, the Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse at Casa Columbia University. That's where these stats come from. 75% of all high school students have used some addictive substance. 75% of all high school students have used some addictive substance. 46% of all high school students are currently using some addictive substance. And 1 out of every 3 meet the medical criteria for addiction. That's staggering. Why are 1/3 of our high school kids, why are 1/3 of almost 1/2 of our high school kids addicted? Why is this happening? It's something we call, it's like a perfect storm. The perfect storm is, you guys have seen the movie, you know what the perfect storm is. Well, this is it in a different way. It's when the right conditions occur simultaneously and kind of converge and come together to form an even bigger event. or disastrous event. And we have four things that are coming together at one time. They're the media message. Okay, this is what the media is telling us. We have peer pressure, your peer pressure. We have drug availability. And we have the still developing teenage brain. What's the media saying? Movies are saying drinking's acceptable. Celebrities glamorize drug use. Music videos glamorize drinking. So the message the media is sending is cool people drink with no consequences. There are no consequences. Back in the 80s, it was Joe Camel. Movies like 10 Things I Hate About You, or Gossip Girl, or Knocked Up, Superbad. You know, they all have that same drinking is acceptable message. And one of the most popular sitcoms used to be, at least that's when he was still doing it, Charlie Sheen, 2.5 Men. Sheen is a functional drunk, you know, on that. I mean, I used to think he was funny. But now when I think about the message he's portraying, I don't laugh as hard. And between each commercial, there's a Budweiser. Between each segment, there's a Budweiser commercial. Cool people drink with no consequences. You can drink. Don't worry about it. Nothing bad's going to happen. Peer pressure. The average teenager has peer pressure from his friends, stress from school. Best friend says, hey, let's get high. What do you say? Do you say no? You say no to your parents all the time. Why not no to your friends? Stress from school. It's hard to keep your grades up. I know. I'm in school. It's tough. But you're always going to have problems at home. You know, again, I wanted to feel like I was part of something cool. I wanted to belong. And, you know, there's this thing, getting pictures from friends drinking on Facebook and MySpace. You know, it's just going around the internet. So you guys, the teenagers have a huge, they're being inundated with temptation and pressure, unlike it was when I was young. And there's drug availability. You know, where do most teens get their drugs, their prescription medication from the home medicine cabinet. Some have family members that are abusing drugs and alcohol right in front of them. And there's the stat, 34% of teenagers get pills from their family and their friends. And you're told that prescription drugs are safe. If a doctor prescribes it, it has to be safe, right? And the internet is an online drugstore. You can get anything over the internet. Illegal or legal, but mainly illegal. You can get it if you want to, you know, if you're clever enough, you can do it. So drug availability is unbelievably easy. And we have this that came out last summer. Recent advances in brain, if you can't see that, I apologize, but I'll read it. Recent advances in brain research, the MRIs, have confirmed that adolescents, meaning teenagers, are extremely vulnerable to addictive substances, much more than adults, because the parts of their brain which are responsible for judgment, decision-making, emotional, and impulse control are not yet fully developed. This developmental process will not be complete until their mid-20s. Therefore, teens using drugs are more likely to take risks and engage in risky behavior while under the influence, more likely to experience consequences such as damage to parts of their brain that are still under construction, decision-making, memory functions, impulse control, exercising good judgment. That's scary. I wish I'd have known that when I was growing up. It may not have changed me. I don't know. But you know it now. I mean, the word is out. And this makes teenagers predisposed to addiction because their brain is still, you know, they used to think the brain was pretty much done building itself, by the time you were an adolescent. No, they found out that's not true. And we're going to talk a little bit more now. I'm not a neurologist or a brain surgeon, but I'm just reporting what is now public information. But the brain is still being developed. And so when you do drugs and you drink alcohol on a still developing brain, you're taking a huge risk. And here it is. It's the prefrontal cortex, the very front part of the brain there on the left, that isn't done yet. Doesn't finish kind of building itself until about 25 years old. For women, I think it's 23 for men. And that's the part that controls your impulses and makes decisions and makes judgments and controls your emotions. Whereas the part that is already pretty much done is the pleasure and reward center, which is toward the back of the brain, which starts from the back and moves to the front, according to the research. And it's kind of like an entertainment center that isn't completely hooked up, and the remote control hasn't arrived yet. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. So you've got the teenage brain that is still in this developmental stage. Your brain learns first the things that are pleasing and feel good, and then the part of your brain that controls your impulses and decides right from wrong isn't developed yet. So this is what all comes together and forms this perfect storm: the media influence, the peer pressure, the drug availability, and the teenage brain still developing. When you put it all together, you've got this perfect condition for substance abuse. So what is addiction? Well, there's a couple different definitions. One is, here's the clinical. This just changed recently, I think just like a couple weeks ago, and I don't expect anybody to understand it on the first run through because I'm still learning it myself. But here it goes. Addiction is a primary chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. There it is. In the very first line, it talks about the brain. Dysfunction in these circuits leads to characteristic biological, psychological, social, and spiritual manifestations. This is reflected in an individual pathologically pursuing reward and or relief by substance use and or other behaviors. Addiction is characterized by an inability to consistently abstain, impairment in behavior control, craving, diminished recognition of significant problems with one's behaviors and interpersonal relationships, and a dysfunctional emotional response. And like other chronic diseases, addiction often involves cycles of relapse and remission. And the last line is the worst: without treatment or engagement in recovery activity, addiction is progressive and can result in disability or premature death. Now, there's a much easier definition of addiction. Addiction is an uncontrollable craving for and an inability to abstain from drugs and alcohol. There's your easy to understand. Uncontrollable craving and inability to abstain. That's addiction in a nutshell, right there. It's a series of choices that we make, or that someone makes. No one forces anyone to drink, and no one forces someone to take drugs. It begins with the desire to get high and the decision to use. It all begins with that first decision. And then eventually addicts lose their power to choose. So what begins with a choice ends up losing the power to choose, because it takes over your body. And I'm going to show you. The addicts actually become powerless over where the drug takes them. Boy, she looks cool, huh? Drinking's really cool. Been there, done that. But no one chooses to be an addict. Even at the most painful part of my life growing up, I didn't say to myself, well, there's always drug addiction. I never made that choice consciously. First, the person chooses the drug, then addiction chooses the person. How does this happen? Well, this is it. The drug hijacks your brain. Keep in mind, the brain remembers everything. If you can't read it out, I'm going to read it off to you. The drug hijacks your brain. The brain remembers everything. The brain's an amazing thing. Continued use of an addictive drug over time changes the way your brain functions. It changes the way your brain functions. That's scary. When you drink alcohol, smoke pot, or any addictive drug, the brain releases a surge of dopamine. Dopamine is the feel-good chemical in your brain, resulting in pleasure. It gives the person an illusion and sense of well-being and euphoria. The brain's hippocampus remembers and preserves this memory. Hey, wait a minute. The brain says, that felt really good. Do it again and again. Addictive drugs fool the brain, bombards it with dopamine. Eventually, the brain sees the drug the same way as food and water. The brain sees the drug as a matter of survival. The brain rewires itself to the new behavior and adapts to it until it can't feel okay without it. Real pleasure experiences release dopamine naturally. Counterfeit pleasure that comes by dope, comes by drugs and alcohol. And genuine joy and counterfeit pleasure become confused. Priorities become distorted. Getting high is more important than anything. Drugs seduce, hijack the brain, and change it permanently, and never returns to normal. And the addict becomes a different person. That's it. That's what happens inside your brain when in the process of becoming addicted. And it begins with drug abuse. Addiction happens in the brain. So, when a person becomes addicted, they lose their freedom of choice, and they become a slave to the drug. Once a person is in the grip of addiction, they lose their God-given freedom. They sacrifice their ability to choose. Addiction is a type of bondage because the addict's brain is hijacked by the drug. They are driven by the addiction and become slaves to the drug and to the uncontrollable craving, which eventually evolves into a vicious daily cycle of craving, seeking, finding, and using drugs or alcohol. They are continually at odds with themselves and the world around them until one day, predictably, the daily cycle of craving, seeking, finding, and using drugs turns into a downward spiral and the ride to the bottom begins. This, brothers and sisters, is addiction. And it's fatal. This is a list I compiled of some kids. I was going to compile a whole list of as many teenagers as I could find, but I realized real soon that I was going to run out of screen and run out of slides. So I just put a few names up there. Tyler Townsend was 15. He died of a drug overdose in 2007. Alexa Oliveira, Monica Tocuz, Joseph Jimenez, 17. It goes on. The list is much, much, much longer than that. And that's my sister on the right, Janie. Janie died in 2001 as a direct result of alcoholism. That's her son on the left, Pepper. He's doing well today. So does anybody know what the most prescribed drug in America is today? I don't see any hands up. Oh, wait a minute. I'm by myself. It's Vicodin. Over 131 million prescriptions of Vicodin were written by doctors in 2010. To give you an idea, there are roughly 308 million people in the United States. Now I know I'm comparing people to prescriptions, but it just gives you an idea of how many 131 million prescriptions are. And doctors prescribe Vicodin for stress. I mean, they prescribe it for pain, but people use it for stress, fear, and anxiety. And it works fine for a while. You know, prescription drugs are safe. Yes and no. They're safe if they're taken under the guidance of a doctor. No, if they're abused. Last year, 1,400 babies were born addicted. And over 1,000 people died from opiate overdose. So, are prescription drugs safe? Well, opiates are pain pills, and here are some of the consequences. You have your underperformance at school. Yep, it's going to show up. Stunted emotional development. Poor concentration for multitasking. In other words, you can't stay centered on something long enough to finish it. Poor judgment. We know that you get less inhibited when you drink, so there's poor judgment. Unplanned sex because of what I just said, low inhibitions and self-control. Can lead to addiction, memory, amnesia, financial problems. Drugs are a money pit. Depression, suicide. 1 out of every 12 teenagers attempts to suicide. And of course, overdose. So are they safe? You tell me. They are if you take them as prescribed and under the guidance of a doctor. Each year, we're going to talk about marijuana. Each year, over 100,000 people, mostly teenagers, seek treatment for their inability to control their marijuana use. They suffer from compulsive and uncontrollable marijuana craving, seeking, and using. Remember, we just talked about craving, seeking, and using? So anybody that thinks that marijuana is not addictive, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, it is. The DEA classifies marijuana as a Schedule I narcotic. Schedule I narcotics are drugs considered having the highest abuse potential and are not considered legitimate for medical use. Tell California that. Other Schedule I drugs are heroin and LSD. Marijuana is also a gateway drug. You know, your ability to say no each time you use any drug gets harder and harder. And the first time you use marijuana, the next time it gets easier and easier to use and harder to say no. You open a door that's very hard to close. I know, I fought that spiritual battle for 25 years. Marijuana is a gateway drug. End of story. Here are some of your short-term effects of substance abuse. These are just short-term. Memory loss, trouble thinking straight, trouble problem solving. This sounds like a lot of things you need in school. Decreased muscle strength, loss of motor skills, increased heart rate, increased anxiety. It impairs your driving ability, problems concentrating, and not to mention jail. I'm not trying to scare anybody because I know I can't scare teenagers and I would never try to scare you. I want to educate you because there's power in knowledge. Long-term memory loss. I have to use cue cards. I'm using them right now. And I'll tell you why, because my memory has been affected by the amount of drugs that I used in the past. Lung disease, male infertility, ouch. Permanent brain changes, possible addiction. Did I mention memory loss? Sorry, I forgot. Possible schizophrenia, anxiety, risk of chronic depression, prison. The latest studies have found that marijuana impairs the brain's ability to plan, organize, and solve problems. Remember, make decisions and control behavior and emotions. And if anyone could just give me one good reason to subject yourself to all this, I'll stop right now. Is marijuana a gateway drug? You know, everybody I know used marijuana first. Everybody I know that's an addict, that is, or anybody I know in Alcoholics Anonymous or narcotics, they'll all tell you the same thing. Yeah, sure, marijuana was the first drug. 95% of them will tell you that. See, you cross this invisible line. You lose your conviction. You lose that nailed down decision that I'm never going to do drugs again, because you've already done one. And well, it's one now. I've done this one. In effect, it's a peer-driven rite of passage, yeah. But there's other rites of passage that are a lot healthier. How about going somewhere with your family? That's really great, like Disney World. Initiation to the Bad Boys Club. It opens a door that's hard to close. Your chances of trying another drug become very, very good now. And if you're saying to yourself, you know, it's my life, I'll do what I want to, I'm not affecting anybody but myself. No, let me introduce you to somebody, okay? His name is El Chapo. His name is Chapo Guzman. He's the leader of the Sinaloa cartel, and one of the 7 cartels out of Mexico that smuggle all the drugs into the United States. He's considered the world's deadliest drug lord. They call him Robin Hood, because he so-called steals from the rich and gives to the poor. It's a joke. His net worth is $1 billion plus, and there was a $7 million bounty on him. Forbes magazine has rated him one of the world's most powerful people. I think they caught him a couple of weeks ago. I'm not sure. I'll have to check that. But since the drug wars began in Mexico, over 34,000 people have been killed or murdered over drugs. And you know, 980 of those 34,000 people were under 17 years old. So the man you're looking at is a murderer. And why did I show you this picture? If you're not affecting anyone, you know, I'm not affecting anyone. It's my life. I'll do what I want. Oh, incidentally, 90% of all cocaine and marijuana come from the cartels. You are affecting someone else. Every time you smoke marijuana or buy an illegal drug, you're putting money in his pocket. And if I sound a little irritated, it's because I am. So you are affecting somebody. You're making this man rich. It's just something to consider. The truth is that one day soon somebody is going to walk up to you and say, hey, let's get high, or let's get drunk, or let's smoke up. And if you're not prepared for that moment when it comes, you're going to fall. You're going to fall. So the thing is to decide now with the information that you have today. So what are you going to do? What are you going to say? Who are you going to listen to? What choice will you make? You're going to choose her or him? "2,000 years ago, Jesus gave us the grace and courage to say no to drugs and alcohol. In the Gospel of Mark, chapter 15, verse 23 goes like this. They offered him wine mingled with myrrh, but he did not take it. He was on the cross suffering. And this drink of wine and myrrh was something that they offered to those that were being crucified. It was an act of kindness to diminish their pain, to help diminish their pain. Myrrh was a painkiller, and it was used as a narcotic. Nowadays, we would call that a cocktail. But Jesus refused it, choosing instead to bear the full weight of suffering for man's sins, and choosing to be clear-headed and in control. You see, being cool is being in control. Brothers and sisters, I think, with that single act of refusal, Jesus is speaking volumes to us, to addicts or to anyone struggling with substance abuse. I think he's saying, life isn't going to be easy. It's not always fair. You're going to be challenged. You're going to be tempted. There will be pain. But we can't go reaching for a drink or a drug whenever we're hurt or stressed. But if we embrace our pain, or our suffering, or our stress, and walk through it, hand in hand with Christ, we will emerge a stronger person, a wiser person, and better equipped to deal with it the next time it happens. Life is a gift, brothers and sisters, and God has a purpose and a plan for each and every person. And what we do with it, what you do with it, what you do with His gift will depend on the decisions that you make. Don't waste this precious gift from God by a decision to abuse drugs and alcohol. Jesus saved me from dying from addiction. He'll save you from a life of addiction, a life of substance abuse, and so much more. Each one of you is unique, precious, and unrepeatable. Every one of you was willed into existence by God. You were destined to be right here, right now, at this crucial moment in history to do something great for God. He has a divine plan for you. All you have to do is open your heart to Him. Thanks, everybody. And that concludes the presentation.